Game Boy is not necessarily known for its co-op gameplay, but there's actually some really quality co-op games on the Game Boy that a lot of people probably missed. And this is most likely due to the barrier to entry, as you needed 2 Game Boys and a link cable, as well as 2 copies of the game. But now it's easier than ever to play multiplayer Game Boy games, either through emulation or through the 2-player Mr. Core. And I used a mixture of both of those options for the recording of this video. So let's talk about every co-op Game Boy game. And these are all of the co-op games that I am aware of. There's not a lot of information about this online. There is Wikipedia that has a list of link cable games, but I had to just go through and test games out one by one to determine whether or not they had co-op. So if there are any that I missed, definitely let me know about them. And we're just gonna do this in alphabetical order, because I'm just getting kind of sick of ranking things. The first game is Asteroids. This is a standard port of Asteroids. So if you know that gameplay, basically, you are a spaceship in space and you destroy asteroids. That's basically it. But what makes this one stand out is the co-op gameplay. However, it's not the first port of Asteroids to include co-op. I believe that is the Atari 7800 version that came out in 1987, and this one came out in 1991. One button shoots, the other button teleports you. You hold up to move around. There's not much more about this that stands out. It's Asteroids, but co-op. And it's a pretty decent version of Asteroids. Boomer's Adventure in Asmik World is kind of an interesting game. The objective of the game is to climb to the top of the tower, and each stage you need to find the key to unlock the stairway to the next level. It plays kind of like Heiankyo Alien, where you can dig holes to trap your enemies, and you can also find power-ups to fight the enemies. But if you do it right, you actually don't have to kill any enemies. You just have to find the key so you can unlock the stairway. But the main mechanic that you're going to focus on is digging, as this is how you will find the keys. But each level is a race against the enemies, because sometimes they can find the key before you, and if that happens, then you have to fight them. This game gets really difficult really quick, so it'll definitely benefit you to play this game with a partner in 2-player co-op. This is another game that doesn't restrict you to one screen, so it works really well to play this in multiplayer. So you can save some time by splitting up to look for the key separately. Double Dragon 2 is a unique port of the game that only came out on the Game Boy. It's totally different from the arcade version, the NES version, or the PC Engine CD version. Unlike the original Double Dragon on Game Boy, this one actually allows you to play in 2-player co-op, and you can play through the entire story with a friend. The gameplay is a little bit slow, but once you get the hang of it, it feels pretty good. When you press both buttons, you duck, and then after ducking, if you push punch or kick, you're able to pull off other moves like an uppercut. This one doesn't have any jumping, which is okay with me. In my opinion, the worst part of Double Dragon 2 on NES was the platforming, so there's none of that here. If you play through the game in easy mode, you're not going to get the full experience. You actually have to play in the harder difficulties in order to actually play all of the levels. I've always had a problem with that mechanic. That's what they did in Golden Axe also. Just give us the whole game, but an easier version. This is definitely an underrated beat 'em up that is totally worth checking out. And then we also had Double Dragon 3. This one is also an exclusive to the Game Boy, but it definitely takes more inspiration from the arcade Double Dragon 3. The gameplay is a lot faster than number 2, but it's also way more difficult. Like the arcade version, this one introduced shops, and you can go in the shops and upgrade some of your stats. And you're gonna have to if you want to get anywhere in this game. I don't think that this one is great. If you're gonna play one of the Double Dragons on Game Boy, definitely go with number 2. Fortified Zone is kind of a mix between the top-down levels of Contra and Zelda. It plays kind of like a dungeon crawler, but the coolest thing about this is being able to play this with a friend with the link cable support, as you each have your own screen, so you can split up to divide and conquer. This is perfect for this kind of game, because you can go fight all the enemies and then meet up in the middle to do the boss fight. The game does have a few drawbacks, like there's a bit of flickering and slowdown, and whenever you defeat all the enemies in a screen, if you re-enter that area, the enemies respawn. But that being said, this is definitely a hidden gem worth seeking out, and there's only 4 levels, so you can play through it pretty easily. Ikari No Yousai 2, also known as Fortified Zone 2. This one improves upon the original game in pretty much every way possible. You're able to change weapons on the fly, which is very helpful, as you're going to need to switch to the grenade launcher to take out walls. You now have 8-way movement, and there's just better performance and better controls. It's just a more cohesive and polished experience overall. The female character is faster, and the man has more health. There's also a password system here, and it's really simple. You just put in a few characters, and you can pick up from any level, which is definitely helpful because the game is very difficult and there are no continues. This one only came out in Japan. Yeah, again, this is another one that's just totally a hidden gem. If you like Zelda, if you like those top-down levels in Contra, or dungeon crawlers, or just co-op games in general, you definitely need to try Fortified Zone 2. Gauntlet 2. This is basically the same as the NES version of Gauntlet 2. It's a top-down dungeon crawler, where you can play as various classes, and you go through mazes and take out enemies. You're probably all familiar with Gauntlet, and this is just another good version of that game, but it still has that really annoying thing where your health is slowly draining. I don't know why they included that in the home ports of this game. Unlike the NES version, you can only play this one in 2-player co-op. And another drawback is there's no music for some reason. I guess the Game Boy just couldn't handle that. The Game Boy version of Heiankyo Alien has 2 different modes, and they're simply called Old and New Mode. The New Mode has a versus option, and the Old Mode is basically just a port of the original 1979 Heiankyo Alien. And this one includes a co-op mode. The original version is actually one of the earliest co-op games ever made. The gameplay is simple. You're these 2 little stick figure guys, and you dig holes. You gotta time it right to get the aliens into the hole. Then you bury them, and that's how you kill them. It's very simple gameplay, but it holds up surprisingly well. And playing this with a friend definitely makes it more interesting. Ninja Boy 2 is a game in the Super Chinese series. You might be familiar with Little Ninja Bros that came out on the NES. This is pretty much the same as that. It's an RPG that mixes role-playing elements with beat-em-up gameplay. You walk around the overworld map, and you can get into random battles. But instead of turn-based, the gameplay turns into a beat-em-up. And as you fight your enemies, you can level up and upgrade your stats. I would have liked to see this utilize the 2 screens, like some of the other games that I mentioned. Unfortunately, you are stuck on 1 screen here. But it's just cool to see any kind of co-op RPG. So definitely try Ninja Boy 2. Pipe Dream is a puzzle game. It has 2 multiplayer modes. Mode A is versus, and then mode B is co-op. In this mode, you take turns placing pipe pieces down and trying to connect them. It's kind of a race against the clock. As soon as you start, as you're laying your pipes, I guess that's literally where that term comes from that got turned into sexual innuendo. You'll see this fluid that starts going through the pipes. Basically, you and your partner want to work together to have a cohesive track that goes all around the screen. If the pipe ends up going into the wall, or just you don't get a piece out in time, then whatever that liquid is will go through and you'll lose. So it does require a bit of communication and coordination. It's a decent co-op game if you're into puzzle games. Poppin' Twin B. If you are familiar with the Twin B series, it's what is known as a cute-em-up, which is basically a shoot-em-up, but cute. This one's pretty generic, but that doesn't mean it's bad. One button shoots the enemies in front of you, and then another button drops bombs to hit the enemies beneath you on the ground. You can collect bells to power up your weapons. Outside of Asteroids, this is the only co-op shoot-em-up on the Game Boy. Rolan's Curse is an action RPG. This one is clearly inspired by the Zelda games, and it's one of my favorite co-op games on the system. It might be the earliest example of a co-op Zelda-like. Although the gameplay is much more linear and straightforward than the Zelda games, it still has a lot of the same elements. It's a top-down action RPG type of game where you take on various monsters and you go through mazes and you power up your weapons. But this one has levels instead of an open world. But playing this in 2-player co-op is what really makes it shine. As I stated before, I think the best way to utilize the link cable support for these games is when you're not stuck on one screen and you can actually split up and divide and conquer. Rolan's Curse utilizes this option very well. Of course, you could stay together to fight the enemies, but it's nice to have the option to split up. Again, this is just another really great hidden gem that's worth seeking out. Sneaky Snakes. This is pretty much a Game Boy version of Snake Rattle and Roll. If you played that on the NES, that one was an isometric game. It has a lot of the same gameplay here, but now it's a 2D platformer. The object of the game is to collect the little balls to increase the length of your tail. Once your tail is long enough, you go into the end and drop off the balls and fill up the meter, and then you can complete the level. But if the meter does not fill up, you're going to have to go back and fight more enemies to extend your tail until you have enough to fill up the meter to progress forward. This is another one where you can split up. I can't imagine having to coordinate on one screen for this game. That would definitely be a pain in the ass. This is the most recent co-op game I've discovered for the Game Boy, and it's way better than I thought it would have been. I actually prefer this over Snake Rattle and Roll. I think the 2D platforming gameplay works much better than the isometric gameplay of that version. Let's talk about Super Chinese 3. This one came out only in Japan, and it's the sequel to Ninja Boy 2. Honestly, this is pretty much just more of the same, but it might be a little bit more refined. It's the same RPG mixed with beat-em-up gameplay. I don't know what else to say about this one, as there's not much else about it that stands out, but if you like the original, you'll definitely like this one too. Titus Fox is an interesting 2D platformer. It's not a great platformer, but it's definitely not as bad as some people have made it out to be, especially when you play it in co-op. Yeah, it plays pretty slow, and the platforming isn't great. It just feels kind of floaty. But again, what makes it better, it's the ability for you and your partner to split up and explore the levels separately. In order to fight the enemies, you can pick up boxes and various items and throw them at them. And the objective of the game is very simple. You just get to the end. And if one player gets there, you both move forward. One thing that's interesting is when you put it onto hard mode, the gameplay actually moves faster. I don't know why they implemented that. They should have just made it that speed from the beginning, because it kind of feels like it's in slow motion at parts. This one kind of plays like Chippendale Rescue Rangers, but just not as good. And another thing that kind of sucks is you can't see your health unless you pause the game. Anyway, despite some of the negativities and the bad reputation that this game has, I actually think it's worth trying out, but I probably wouldn't do it single player. Ultima Ruins of Virtue. This is a top-down action RPG, and it came out in 1992 in the US. There are various classes. You have a mage, a bard, a knight, and a ranger. The combat here is not great, and the controls are a little bit unresponsive. And when you're playing with a friend, you cannot pass through each other. So if one of you is standing in a doorway, it can be kind of annoying as you can't get through. You are able to split up if you're in the same area, but if you want to go to an exit to move to another area, you have to wait for your partner. So there are positives and negatives to this mechanic. This is not one of the best action RPGs that I've played, but I am glad that it exists. And for being a Game Boy game, it's not terrible, but the sequel is a lot better. So let's talk about that one. Ultima Ruins of Virtue 2. Yeah, the visuals are better, and the controls are better, and the combat is way better. Just all around, there's a lot more polish here. It even has some kind of cool cutscene visuals. Like the original game, you have various classes here, and it's definitely a good idea to choose different classes between players. Like if one can focus on close combat and the other can focus on long distance combat. And like the original, you can split up and explore the dungeons separately. There's only a handful of co-op RPGs to come out in the 8-bit era, but this is definitely one of the best ones. So there you have it. There are all of the co-op Game Boy games that I am aware of. If there's any that we missed, let me know. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you check out our video about the top 30 co-op NES games. Thanks for watching.